Welcome. This is Plant-Based Messaging That Works, Narrative Strategy for Food Systems, and we're here with our guest, Mark Westcombe. My name is Jennifer Channin, and I am the Executive Director of the Better Food Foundation. And for those who are joining us from around the world, please introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know your name, where you're from, and if you're here with an organization, and we'll get started in just a minute. And for someone who just asked, we are going to record this and the recording will be made available afterwards. Yeah, I'm seeing people from all over the place. A lot of people throughout the United States, but a few people from the UK and from other parts of the world, from Mexico. That's exciting. Okay, let's get started. Hello again, everybody. This is Plant-Based Messaging That Works, Narrative Strategy for Food Systems. My name is Jennifer Channin. I'm the Executive Director of the Better Food Foundation. And this discussion today is part of our series called Shifting Food Norms, where we invite experts and leaders who do interesting work to change our food system to come and talk about what they do. And today I am very excited to have with us Mark Westcombe. Mark is the founder and director of a group called Animal Think Tank. Animal Think Tank is an organization based in the UK that is devoted to the goal of animal freedom. And in today's discussion, we're going to look at some research they've done recently that takes a foray into the question of how to promote plant-based food. But first, Mark, I want you to have an opportunity to introduce yourself. Can you tell us a bit about your work and why you started Animal Think Tank?
Yeah, so I came into the movement maybe 7, 8 years ago. I was a semi-regular person. I worked in industry. Um, and I'd been a volunteer mostly in the environmental movement. And I read, I'd been a vegan for 20 years. I grew up on an animal farm. And I read a book on the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade in the UK. And like on chapter 3 or chapter 4, that it just totally inspired me. I was just like, this is what we need to be doing. And so I sort of left the environmental movement, left my job, and set up Animal Think Tank um, with the goal of sort of of mobilization. So, I mean, what really inspired me, both in the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade, I had no idea how many hundreds of thousands of people were involved on the streets of that. But it was just like, yeah, all the social movements we think of, like when we celebrate victory, I was thinking of people on the streets. So it's just like, yeah, let's get people on the streets. My background is in sort of national infrastructure projects. So they often have timeframes of 30 to 70 years, often sort of conceptualization, but it's even pre-planning. Just what do we want? It's like 7 years. So I came, I suppose, then into the movement with that kind of, 25 years of that sort of thinking. Where do we want to be in 50, 150 years' time? And how do we design a strategy working back from that goal? So that's why a lot of our work often appears to be research orientated. I mean, we're kind of more like an R&D department of a movement that's yet to get going from us, where we're trying to like work out how do we get to the end goal. I suppose I'll just add that, yeah, when we got going, it was kind of like, so what have the social movements done? So like we dug around into social movement theory and social movement literature, and one of the first things we came across was narrative. And that was really compelling to me, that like unless you've got a well-reasoned, well-thought-out, well-researched narrative that's going to land with the public, then you're going to get very limited impact from any campaigning. So that's why we're kind of known as narrative people, but it's kind of like, well, that's where you need to start.
Thank you. Yeah, so the topic that we're going to focus on for the first half of our discussion today is then actually a bit of a detour for your organization,
Mm,
because I know your organization mostly works on more political and ethical questions around how people think and feel about animals.
mm,
But this guide you recently put out has to do specifically with how audiences think about the food they eat. And
mm.
before we dive into the details of that guide, could you tell us a bit what motivated you to create this guide, why it matters?
It was one of those accidents. What we were interested in is segmenting the UK population to understand on an ethics basis. So we're interested in institutionalizing rights. So how do people think about rights in the UK for animals, and how could we persuade them? And in doing that, I was just persuaded that, like, well, if you're segmenting for ethics, then you can like segment for food. So we just kind of accidentally stumbled into it, and it seemed like a very small project and detour, but I think the data and the results has kind of like revealed things to us that we weren't expecting. So now we're putting a lot more effort into it. Hey, there's a lot more here to be learned than we thought.
Yeah, so I found the guide to be really interesting, but at a very high level, it
Mm,
segments audiences into five audience types. And
mm,
I would invite the audience today to go into the chat and open up the report itself, because on page 6 is where it shows those audience segments. And I'm going to actually share briefly what those look like so that you can see. Can you walk us through those five audience segments? Because that's going to be pretty important for the conversation that we have.
Yeah, maybe I should say a little bit about segmentation first. So, I mean, there's a mantra that if you message to everyone, you message to no one. And so, value segmentation is there are different groupings of people, and they're going to be more disposed to certain types of messaging and certain types of action that could support your movement than others. So the idea is that you can then refine how you message and where you might message. So, like if we've got Project Slingshot at the moment in London, so that's on the metro system. So everybody is seeing that, but a lot of messaging can be done sort of more in channels that are more specific. So, in the UK, there's a publication called Ethical Consumer. It's quite a big publication, a lot of people buying it. And so we know that they're going to be thinking a certain mind frame. And so, like, you might send a very different message there to the one you might send on the underground or through lots of other channels. So, looking at food, and there are different ways of segmenting. There's different projects out there. So, what we looked at was not at consumer behavior, or what's often popular is looking at people's intentions. What we did is psychographic profiling. So we're kind of looking at the underlying values that people hold that might dispose them towards supporting us, or in this case, like shifting behavior, and how might they shift their behavior. And what we found was 12% ardent meat eaters. Like, there's just very, very little openness. Um, if you put a dish in front of them, they might not turn it away. They might laugh at you though. We've got meat lovers, and that's just 12% of the population. We've got meat lovers, so 29% of the population. So they like meat. They're really into the taste of meat. But they are open to change, but it's just not something they've considered, and they're not actively open to it. I'll jump maybe to the bottom of the slide. So we've got active ethical eaters. So these are people who've already are either really disposed to shifting their eating patterns, or most likely they already have. So this would be your vegans, vegetarians, pescatarians, flexitarians, reducitarians, mostly. 10% of the population. And bearing in mind that, like in the UK, roughly 3% of the population is vegan, then there is scope within that segment. So like they're so close to it. It's just like, well, we could double or triple the number of vegans or people with a plant-based diet just by targeting that one group. There's a really big opportunity there. They're convinced, they just haven't matched their practices necessarily, or they're content, like the vegetarians are content with their practices being in line with their values. Hesitant ethical eaters, 20%. They're uncomfortable eating animals, like the values are there, they thought about it, they are thinking about changing, their actions haven't caught up with their values. And then the interesting group in the middle, 29%, we call them conflicted conformists. They do feel a bit guilty about eating animals, but they haven't started to think about changing their diet. And what's really interesting about this group is they're very, very influenced by what other people are doing around them. So they'll follow the crowd. So although they're relatively open, ultimately they're going to do what everybody else is doing. So yeah, hopefully that's enough of a starter on them.
Yeah, definitely. Um, and at the Better Food Foundation, where our mission is about changing food norms, it's really
Mm,
interesting for us to look at this breakdown of audiences because it's really that middle section that's most influenced by norms, by what other people do.
mm,
Um,
mm,
and it's always helpful to know who our message is going to land with and who our message is not going to land with. One of the takeaways in your guide is that a lot of marketing and advocacy around plant-based food is targeting people at the extreme ends of this spectrum when it should be targeting the people in the middle who are the most open to change. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? Is that what you
Yeah,
observe?
maybe I'd nuance that. I'd say it, I would encourage to be targeting the people close to us who that extreme. So what we call the ethical. So they're primed, like they just need tipping over. The encouraging bit is how big that movable middle is. Like if you put the hesitant and the conflicted together, that's 50% of the population, and so there's a willingness and openness to move there. I think it's the top 20, so it's the other 40%, it's the meat lovers and the ardents. It's just like you're going to get really little bang for your buck, either by targeting them with meat mimicry products, so the brands, you're not going to get much sales there, or advocacy. And I mean, really, the idea of the project is to target, and like what we would do is encourage people to target that first 10%, the people who are almost there, the ethical eaters, and then as the next choice, probably to target the hesitant. But they'll probably need different messaging. What both of them need really is that they don't need persuading. What they need is support to make the transition. It's like they've climbed the hill and they just need to get onto the other side of it. And some hills are just really scary, that the crux on the top. So there's something a lot around the practice. Like they don't know the recipes, they're stuck in habits. It might be that there's a partner, they haven't got the time. So it's helping them on the journey. So I mean, this is only phase one of a three-phase project. So I'm sort of, I would caveat this, but I mean, at the moment, I'm more tempted to say we could maybe, for those first two, for that first 30% of the population, the most movable, is maybe we could drop the advocacy around why they should go vegan or eat more plant-based and actually help them understand how they do it. So like, here's a really easy recipe. Chuck in a tin of lentils, chuck in 100 grams of pasta, put in a stock cube, stir it, put some oil in at the end, bang. Like that might help them make the shift more than anything. I sort of understand, like, and this is more anecdotal, but when I'm talking to others in the movement leaders, I often wonder if there's a sort of a subconscious impulse to target the baddies and like convert them, and like the ones that we think are eating all the animals. And it's just like, well, actually, they're not eating that much more than the ones who are close to us. And it's just a long, long, long way from being converted. So let's get the easy two segments first, and then um, the conflicted conformists then maybe second, but depending on what type of advocacy you're doing. So, like your organisation, from what I understand, is a lot of by default, a lot of institutional. So that is a great way of targeting the conformists, because what you're doing is like they're in a social environment, they're seeing other people buy plant-based food, and that makes them feel safer socially to do the same. So there are different strategies for food companies, advocacy organisations, and then even within advocacy organisations as well, and I suppose the service industry.
Yeah. So you started to answer this question, but
Mm.
I'm wondering if you have more examples of either campaigns or marketing messages out there that you think do a pretty good job of targeting uh, those two middle groups, either the hesitant
Mm.
ethical eaters or the conflicted conformists. Or maybe the difference between the two,
Yeah.
because it's a different.
So, okay, yeah. So I think with the conflicted conformists, and I would like the results from phase two to be able to answer this really accurately, but I would say the conflicted conformists in the middle, the best way for now, until there are more people eating plant-based food, is that sort of institutional buying. It's like food canteens, universities, hospitals, public organizations, and just making it look normal. So, that's probably the best route. And then with the hesitants, so they are persuaded. I'm going to check my notes here a bit. They are persuaded by the values. So we did, but they resist messaging. So basically, they don't want more messaging. They don't want to be told what to do. I think they're protecting their autonomy. Um, but what they really want is how. So it's confident. They're looking for confidence. I guess they're looking for recipes. Um, I mean, I'm just really conscious of like, in the last 3 years, I've gained a lot of weight. So I've been like really intending to go on a diet. Like, have I managed? I do a day, a meal. It's just like, it's hard. So, um, I'm like, I've got relatively straightforward lives. So people with more complicated lives, it probably is support that they need. So yeah, so I think, like I said before, is the messaging probably needs to go more towards supporting them rather than persuading them.
Yeah. In our work at the Better Food Foundation, the students that we train, they're often dealing directly with people who work in university dining.
Mm.
And they tell
Mm.
us the same thing over and over again, which is that in their university dining, the most vocal students are the ardent meat eaters or
Mm.
the active ethical eaters. And that's
Mm.
who dining leaders tend to cater to because they're very sensitive to whichever groups complain the audience,
Yeah,
the loudest.
yeah.
But what that results in is dining that's set up so that there's usually a very well-marked vegan section for vegan
Mm.
students, and it's very kind of ethically focused. Maybe it's, also super healthy, no fat, no flavor, and it's just for the vegans. And then there's very flashy displays of animal products that really lean into the values associated with meat eating, masculinity,
Mm.
strength, domination, all of those
Mm.
things. What might you say to a dining director at a university, or perhaps to a student who's about to advocate
Mm.
to a dining director, to kind of open them up to targeting food towards students in the middle of these extremes?
Yeah, I think what we need to do as a movement is like break out of our current assumptions and strategies around plant-based food. And the dominating assumption is meat mimicry. Is And there are different ways of selling food. So, most people are not looking at food and going, oh, is this meat or is it not meat? But they can be easily triggered into that if you've got symbols around it. So one of our findings was don't trigger people into deciding whether something's vegan or not. What people who, that 60% that are open, what seems to be working with them is familiarity. So if you're introducing dishes or making twists on dishes, like have some degree of familiarity. So in the UK, there's a lot of people saying that they're very open to eating more pulses, but then the data doesn't back up that they're doing it. Probably there's a capability gap; they don't know how to do it. But if I was in the service industry, or as a university caterer, I'd probably just like, okay, so what pulses are British students familiar with? So they see something familiar. So for us, we have something called mushy peas, which is like large peas. They're dried. They're more like pulse. Every fish and chip shop sells them. So you can make stews or soups or risotto dishes with them, and there's a familiarity there. So I think that's one. And mushrooms, we're still digging into the data. I mean, the data's so rich, and we're still going deep, but it does really look like mushrooms could be a real sell for people. It's really interesting how many mushrooms meat eater, or the whole categories are eating through the week, and they're familiar. They've got meaty texture. They can have meaty flavour. So I'm very interested in the few companies like Palace Foods and Mushroom Meat Company that are sort of pursuing those agendas. The other thing then I would say about how to sell foods at a university canteen, make it exciting. Don't make it about being vegan. It's like, well, what do people want? Well, they want a sense of occasion. They want an indulgence. And they want novelty. They want variety. So global foods, so there's so many global foods that are accidentally vegan, and different countries have different cultures. Like Germany's got much more exposure to sort of Middle Eastern food, UK Indian food. I'm guessing in the US, sort of South American food. All of these cultures bring loads of sort of pulse-based meals that, so I'd be starting in those places. So yeah, not trying to sell it, but trying to make dishes stand on their own legs. Tell me if I don't make any sense.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. And it completely reflects what we see in the fields, in the
Mm,
direction that the more kind of progressive food universities are going in, is
mm,
particularly focusing on those international flavors to make food that's based on plant-based ingredients more
mm,
exciting, but also culturally comfortable for different students.
mm, mm.
And speaking of culture,
Uh,
your research was all done in the UK. Is there anything that those of us who are in other countries should know when we're using this research? What's
mm.
going to apply, what we might take with a grain of salt?
Yeah, so generally we say be cautious about using any UK narrative work outside of the UK. So to be judicious. Um, just the word freedom means something so different for an American, for a Brit, and for a French person. So we've got a lot of resources about how to message. So I would say be judicious. Um, I think that this particular study, I think, could transfer over. The numbers are going to look different in different countries. I'd say they transfer over maybe to cultures that have some similarity with the UK. So, like Northern Europe, probably Australia, Canada, the US. My guess is there will be a difference with like South. Southern European countries because they've got very different food heritage there and relate very different. They might eat similar quantities of meat, but they relate to meat in very different ways and relate to vegetables and the alternatives in different ways. So there are different opportunities there, and I'm guessing there's probably large parts. I don't know the demographics of the US, but it's probably large parts that are heavily influenced by South American, Central American food and cooking, and so there'll be different opportunities there. But I would say on the whole, you it would translate over. Um, but if something doesn't land with you, then like maybe trust your gut, like, oh, maybe this doesn't translate over.
Thanks. Yeah. And so I want to start to transition to the second set of questions, which are going to be about kind of deeper narrative change.
Mm,
But to bridge that discussion, we live in a time of pretty extreme polarization in the media and social discourse. And I'm sure many of the
mm,
people on this webinar today are people who write about food, who post about food on social media, who try to get, more attention onto the issue of plant-based food. And there can be a lot of pressure for those of us doing that kind of work to, get more eyeballs, get more clicks. And what we've been
mm,
told over and over again
mm,
is that appealing to the extremes and leaning into that kind of polarized discourse gets the most clicks, right? It
mm,
gets the most eyeballs. Um, but perhaps that's not what creates the lasting social change. And perhaps that's not what appeals to those individuals who are most open to change in their diets.
mm.
So, what advice might you give to plant-based food advocates facing these kinds of pressures to stay grounded and focused on the audiences that are truly most open to change?
Yeah, there's probably sort of two answers here. Um, like one generally, like I would say, good strategy is a lot about ignoring the noise. It's like you determine your strategy and stick with it. I think the first step is we do have a tendency to try to communicate to everyone, and we can often be upset about alienating some segments more. So I'd say the first strategy is like choose your segment and then develop a comms strategy towards that segment. And that involves both what type of messaging you do, but it's also what channels are you going to use, um, and not get distracted. So that would be the first step. Is actually don't message to everyone, message to a segment. There is something in social movement theory called polarization, and that a lot of people are not persuaded by your cause, but they're persuaded by not wanting to identify with those on the other side. The UK had a referendum 10 years ago around leaving the European Union. I was in favour of leaving the European Union, but for reasons that were different to the norm. So I voted to stay within the European Union because I was repulsed by the messaging and the narratives and the stories of the Leave movement. That's a case study of one, but yes, it kind of backs up the social movement theory. Um, like we generally, when you're looking at ballot initiatives or referendums, like most successful organisations have said, like they've aimed for 65% of the population, and they've been happy with polarising the other 35%. So it is that middle that you've been talking about. It's like we want to keep our base with us and mobilise them, and then we want to bring the middle with us. I feel I have more to say there, but I'll let you.
Lately, it seems like the word narrative and narrative change has become more of a buzzword in food systems advocacy. And I've been really happy to see the concept of narrative getting more attention, but I don't always see it being used in the same way or
Mm,
perhaps being used accurately. And so we've been talking about creating messages for diet change.
Mm.
Could you tell us the difference between what messages are and what narratives are?
Yeah, I'll give it a go. I really should like dedicate a day to working out my 1 minute elevator pitch on this. I think we're bombarded by messaging, comms, social media, newspaper articles, advertising. And what most of that is doing is communicating information to us, facts. Or that's how it can appear. There's a lot of canny marketing going on, but it can appear that it's communicating facts and information to us. So we can understand that that's what comms is, communicate facts and information. And so we can just um, draft comms, whether it's a social media post or media post, press release, in isolation to all the other work that we're doing, and kind of think like, oh, this goes out and it might has an effect in and of its own. So I kind of call that content-based comms. And I think it's what a lot of EDs of organizations expect, because they're not comms trained and they're replicating what they're seeing. There's then strategic comms, which I actually think like the movement should be shifting towards more necessarily the narrative change first. So strategic comms is integrating comms and campaigns. So when you start in a campaign on day one, your comms lead is in the room crafting your campaign with you. And fundamentally, you're kind of deciding, well, what's the objective of this campaign in 6 months or 3 months or 3 years' time, and how can we get there? And what sort of comms and campaigning do we do together? And I'm a massive proponent of that. So Animal Rebellion, an organisation, was involved in setting up. What often happens in the non-profit sector is we have campaign teams, and then comms teams are service to the campaigns. And we inverted it. So we had a comms team, and they commissioned sort of campaigns and actions to fit the storytelling. And so strategic comms is normally you've got a policy goal. How do you change the political discourse? How do you change opinion around that policy goal in a 1 to 3 year time frame to achieve that policy goal? And then narrative change is how do you shift the common sense of the public across 10, 20, 30 years to create a platform for lots of legislative initiatives. So you're looking at kind of like the deep subconscious thinking that's going on, the shifting of the norms about seeing animals as other to seeing animals as kin, to understanding that animals have emotions and abilities and inner lives similar to us, so that you've developed a relationship. You see animals as individuals, and you're able to take the perspective of animals. So that would be a narrative shift that's going to take a generation or more. So that, yeah, so for me, there's the three things. It's the sort of like kind of comms, everything is ad hoc, it's pushed out, it's independent. Strategic comms, where you've got this cumulative effect, where you planned each bit of comms to be coherent to achieve a short-term, medium-term goal. And then narrative change, where all the comms is coherent around a particular story you're trying to shift. And if you're doing strategic comms, you can be grounding it in narrative change as well as your policy objectives. So if you're trying to shut down factory farms, so look, the big narrative that we push in the UK is animals' inner lives, and demonstrating that animals have similar inner lives to us, and that's what we see as the most successful, as persuading the public to support animal rights, animal welfare, animal freedom. If you're trying to shut down factory farms, you can draw on animals' inner lives in your messaging or in your campaigning, and we can do the same in vegan. Trying to persuade people to go vegan, although we're kind of saying, there's a large proportion of persuaded by the values, they just need help to do it. But if you were trying to like target the conflicted conformists who haven't started thinking about it, they are open to animal welfare messaging, and you can be drawn on the same narrative or deep narrative of animals' inner lives and a sense of kinship to develop their value system to encourage them to go plant-based. I've got to do my one day sit down to get my elevator pitch sorted on that.
Well, to go a bit deeper into that, Animal Think Tank has a guide on narrative change that says that helpful narratives can shift what people believe is right and what they think is possible. And harmful narratives can make the status quo feel natural and inevitable, even to
Mm.
people who know something is wrong. So, focusing on food and diet, what are some of these harmful narratives that are pervasive in food culture that can make it hard for us to change the status quo or hard for us to get people who know something is wrong to take that next step?
Yeah, so I'm going to duck the question and answer it a different way. And there is a logic to it, I hope. Um, so one of the big narrative thinkers is somebody called George Lakoff. He's a linguist, and he's persuaded a lot of the left not to argue within your opposition's frame or within your opposition's narrative. And instead of tackling the argument within your adversary's frame or tackling the facts, what you have to introduce is an antidote narrative. So you push your narrative independent of the bad narratives that are out there. So that's why I'm not naming the bad narratives that are out there. Because what he says is if you name the bad narratives, or if you argue against the bad narratives, or if you argue within the frame of your bad narratives, then you've actually reinforced them. You have the counter effect. So when we say like meat is murder, in the long term, what that actually does, it just reinforces meat is normal. So there's just loads of our messaging where we're challenging around meat or other norms that actually cognitively it's hard to believe and understand. It has the opposite effect. So for me, there are bad narratives out there. How do we tackle them? But we have to run with our own narratives, a bit similar to the question you asked before. We have to be really careful not to fall into the framing of the opposition or the framing that's out there. So we have to really, really, when I see a plant-based burger in my social media stream, and I'm just scrolling up, I might read the title, I probably don't. What I actually see is a burger. And what that actually does is reinforce the idea that, oh, I like burgers. Oh, I might get a burger tonight. So whatever the message is saying is like what's actually landed is like, oh yeah, burgers are part of normal everyday eating. So the harmful narrative. So I'm not going to make any friends saying this, but harmful narratives are probably the ones that we're driving that we could be avoiding. So in this phase one of our study, the message that has the most pushback across all the segments, including the ethical eaters, is when you introduce the word vegan. As soon as there's a concept of like go vegan or go plant-based or eat plant-based or anything, it's just like defenses up. It has a counter effect, like people withdraw, people are less inclined. So we've advocated this before. It's like the go vegan message is not a winning message. The other one that is coming out through the research is the higher welfare narrative. So if we improve, so people in the focus groups that we're running, a lot of them are naming like higher welfare, so that makes it okay. So it's kind of like this: have your cake and eat it. So they're persuaded to not eat. That there are values about not eating animals or caring about animals, but then like they're comfortable with then being told like, oh, well, everything's okay actually if we do it this way. So not that I'm not trying to avoid that agenda generally, but it is something that's come out through our focus groups. And then the last narrative I think we should be avoiding is the strategy we're pursuing, which is meat mimicry. We've made this assumption that's become a doctrine that the way to get people off meat is to provide them with an analogous product that's been made in some other fashion for fake meat. And it's an assumption. What we're finding in our work is it's only the vegans or the people like the ones who really are dedicated to an ethical diet that are eating the meat mimicry. The others, and that's backed up. So GFI's got some data. I think it's 82% of plant-based sales go to 7% of households, and lots of households have one vegan, but the others aren't. So it's probably the vegans who are driving that 82%, and nearly everybody else. It's like they don't buy; they buy once. There's extremely limited households that buy more than 3 times a year. So we've pursued a meat mimicry in our products, and I can totally understand it was like it's a good idea, but it's a dominating strategy, and people aren't open to it. Like what we're finding is the ardent meat eaters and the meat lovers, they're much more open to a vegetable dish that's familiar to them, like a risotto, or something that they recognize like from their family or from their social set. They're much more open to that than the meat mimicry. So they're using the same words as us. They're using disgust. They find them disgusting. But so that there's a product strategy there that might not be working for us. It's not to dismiss it entirely, but the sales that go into vegans, and we might have, we might be maxed out there. Unless we increase the number of vegans, we might not increase sales there. But the real problem, I think, is the narrative aspect, which is it kind of breaks Lakoff 101, which is do not frame your proposition within your adversary's frame. So what we've done, we've said like our proposition is fake meat, which is in the frame of meat. And then our language often is around meat. So we're trying to sell the idea around the language of meat. For another 10, 20, 30 years, fake meat is not going to match animal meat. So the comparison's always going to fail. And the language is not persuading people. And the products aren't persuading people. So I think we need to move away from vegan meat mimicry and higher welfare. And that's not ideological. That's just like that's what's coming out of the data.
Yeah. At the Better Food Foundation, our vision is a world where plant-based food is the norm, or a world where plant-centered agriculture is the norm. And it's been a real challenge for us working within the English language to find language, words, phrases to talk about the foods we want to normalize, the foods we want to promote in ways that don't, fall into the enemy's narrative. And we sometimes end up with these sort of complicated, overly technical, like deconstructionist sort of language in order to come up with a word that means the thing that we think is the good. um, so how do you balance the kind of pragmatism of wanting to communicate in a way that's gonna feel relatable and normal to people with the
Yes.
long-term
No,
goal of changing the
yeah.
narrative?
No, I think that's. I mean, it's useful. I mean, the words that we use around non-animal meat is new meat.
Mm,
Indy Carr has commissioned us in the UK from Plant Futures. So she's commissioned a study that's happening at the moment, I think, around like finding a word that is persuasive with the public, because we're all, as a movement, we're all using different words, aren't we? Alt or faux meat or plant-based meat or whatever. So I think there's a value in finding a word, and the product is pursuing sort of meat mimicry. So you can't avoid. So there it's appropriate to use a word that raises meat because, of course, the product visually does that. Um, did that help, or did that answer your question, or was it?
Yeah, it helps. You know, a term that we're starting to lean more into at the Better Food Foundation is plant protein, which of
Mm,
course raises up and normalizes the idea that we need a lot of
mm,
protein, which may or may
mm,
not be true or helpful.
mm,
But it does normalize the idea that protein comes from all sorts of sources, including plants.
mm,
Um, so we're tending to say, you know, like plant protein is healthy. That's a kind of
mm,
narrative. Or plant protein is the most traditional way that people have eaten.
mm,
Look at cultures throughout history, and those kinds of narratives that connect to,
mm.
you know,
Yeah, I think
plant-centered
that's
food is traditional, plant-centered food is
yeah.
healthy.
I think that's key is tapping into food heritage and food traditions. So again, there's a level of familiarity, but also people have a lot of nostalgia around food. So if you can tap into nostalgia, I'm also I think plant protein was definitely a big step forward to a lot of the language that was being used. I'm looking forward to seeing what this study comes up with in the UK.
Yeah, and I just saw someone in the chat shared fiber-rich diet. Maybe we should
Mm.
be normalizing fiber as the healthy aspect of food versus protein and other
Yeah, so
components of it.
that's an antidote narrative. So one of the biggest supermarket chains in the UK has just launched a campaign, if a retailer can do that, and it's called Full On Fiber. And basically, when you look at everything they're selling, it's kind of like it is plant based, but they're calling it Full On Fiber, and it's a nice place, but it's very light-hearted how they're doing it. They're making no mention of veganism or plants. I was just like, oh, that's a cracking way to approach it.
Yeah. We've reached a good point to look at the chat and see some of the questions folks are asking. Uh, so we're going to go to the Q&A section of Zoom and see if there's any questions posted there. And if folks want to add more questions, please go ahead. We've got about 10 minutes. This question comes from Narhari Gupta. My question is about the terminology plant-based. If you look up the definition of the term, it often suggests that a plant-based diet may still include small amounts of meat or other animal products. Doesn't that dilute the true meaning and intent of plant-based food? Also, given that our industry already has a limited and often confusing set of terms, if we lose clarity around plant-based as well, aren't we making our nomenclature even weaker? How should we address this challenge?
Yeah, I mean, the problem is we can't own things. So as I understood it, 10 years ago, plant based was 100% plants, and then people trying to make a profit latched on. So I do remember buying something plant that was plant based and it was based in plants, but there was other things in there. But yeah, um, unless we get things trademarked or there's government policy around this, like we can't own terms. So having terms that are hard to manipulate um, would help there.
And you mentioned that changing narratives happens on a scale that can be, I think you said maybe 5 to 10 to 20 years, right? This is
Mm,
almost getting to the level of generational change.
yeah,
How do you, there's, that can both make me feel hopeful, right? That change can happen on that
mm,
scale, even if it doesn't look like it's happening immediately. But it can also be a little bit demoralizing because there's so much pressure to achieve results in the next quarter, in the next year.
yeah. Mm.
Uh, how how do you think advocates can kind of maintain that sort of hopefulness and drive to keep going on narrative change for the amount of time that it takes?
Yeah, and I will clarify, like narrative change is normally talked of as 20, 30, 40 years.
Okay.
I'm conscious that Freedom to Marry did something in 11. Um, for, I mean, the first thing that came to mind was one of my mentors, Carlos Saavedra from INI Institute, who was instrumental behind Obama's Dream Act, and he's been involved in loads of social movements in the US. And I remember him saying to me once, he said, "All you social movement people, you all come to me, and you all think it's the 1950s, and it's all about to kick off. Well, you're in the 1910s." And I think like the more you look into social movement history and theory, like you realize there was decades and decades and decades of strategizing, thinking, failed campaigns. Um, so yeah, I mean, I've been fortunate enough to talk to some people from the Black civil rights movements, and that they were starting strategy. So the Brown versus Board of Education Act, I think it's early 50s. I think they started in 1904 or 1908 or something in strategizing around that. And they ran other strategic litigation campaigns, but it was all to get to that outcome. So I think it was 45 years to get to that one case through court. So the way I keep my hope is just like, well, this is my duty to maintain hope and to communicate hope. And I'm dedicated to this cause, and that's part of the labour is to stay optimistic and to communicate optimism and to know. I mean, I'm resigned to this is an intergenerational struggle, and what I am resigned to is like I hope to hand over to the next generation a better infrastructure to win this fight than what we currently have. So I mean, the INI Institute talk about like you can be orientated to your own advocacy, you can be orientated to your organization's advocacy, you can be orientated towards the movement's advocacy, or you can be orientated towards the tradition, and the tradition is the intergenerational struggle. And yeah, that's a powerful framework for me. And then they also talk about shifting from being orientated towards like being committed to the intergenerational struggle.
Yeah. Personally, that's something I find really inspiring when the measurable results of our day-to-day work can be variable. But the
Mm.
intergenerational struggle, I mean, history shows that things really do and can change because
Mm.
of collective action over decades. Another question from the chat, and this does relate to generations. This is from John. Are there different narratives that work for different age groups?
We were talking about this yesterday in the team. Um, so one of the team was actually asking Rob, who does our quant analysis, whether he could stratify all the data by age groups. But Rob's a social psychologist, and what he was saying is that what tends to happen generally is more that an age group will have a set of values that shifts with them. So you might say, like, if take a slice today, oh, well, 70-year-olds have these values which are different to the 30-year-olds. But if you slide back 40, 50 years, you find that those 70-year-olds, when they were in the 20s, they correlated quite highly to those values. So what we've done, so there's a correlation between age groups and values, so that the age difference would be captured within psychographic profiling or psychographic segmentation. So it would be bringing together, maybe quite a lot of 70-year-olds who's thinking a certain way, but then we'll bring in the 50 and the 30 and the 20-year-olds, maybe in different proportions that think similarly. So we wouldn't generally worry about messaging differently to different age groups for this type of work. There could be campaigns. I'm just thinking, like, well, if you're selling holidays, you might be selling holidays that, on a cruise. That's generally, in the UK at least, pitched more to the older generation. So there might be campaigns that are, your campaign is pitched more to a particular generation because of a set of behaviour, then you would craft messaging to that.
A bunch more questions just came in the chat. One is around the associations with veganism. Are there ways that we can change the associations of veganism from negative stereotypes to caring about animals or the environment?
Yeah, I mean that's a big brand project. It's one that I've been. It's on a list of things to do. Um, I haven't got ideas of it. I think it's fundamental. Um, like we played a little bit around with names, but there's an identity, and vegan is not an aspirational identity. Like who would want to be vegan? It's associated with sacrifice, with dourness, with self-righteousness. Nobody wants that to be that. So we've got a really really big project as a collective, as a movement, to reconfigure an identity that's aspirational for people. Although, in our work, we're not interested in making people vegan. Like what we want is, which is different to the food um, sort of objectives. Like what we want is to gain support for legislation, and you can get a lot of support from people who are not obvious allies. So in the survey we're doing, like there's so much more support for structural change, bold initiatives for systems change and structural change amongst the population than there is for what you might call the weak asks. Um, but the structural changes is tended like, well, government has to do it, somebody else has to do it. And so people are kind of, there's a much more openness to, well, make me vegan, like create a system that I can live in that is vegan, and then it's easy. So, I mean, my sister opened my eyes to this. I mean, I grew up in a farm. My dad's a farm. He's essentially got three vegan boys and an anti-vegan girl as kids. Um, and my sister, who used to be I used to find antagonistic, at least to my diet, was very clear. So if there's ever a referendum to vote against banning factory farms or against banning killing animals, well, I would have to vote with it. I couldn't vote against it. And she's probably in the meat lover, maybe meat ardent camp. So yeah, we can build support without necessarily converting people. That's different, I think, in your realm, because you're trying to get people at an individual level to change behavior. But I guess your work at an institutional level, that's kind of analogous, isn't it? It's like changing the structures around people to make it easy.
Yeah. Well, we have to stop at the hour, at least the recording of this video, which we will share. We have a lot more questions in the chat. Maybe we can kind of respond to them in our follow-up. Um, but right now, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us and thank you, Mark. Um, this has been a really interesting discussion, and I hope it's one of many that we keep on having.
Mm.
And I think it helps us all get a little more aligned in how we approach this major challenge of creating a world where plant-based eating is more normal.
Mm. Yeah, if I could just say this, we've only done phase one, we've got phase two and phase three to go. So like we're very open to input to make sure we're asking the right questions, teasing out the right data, because we're very aware that brands, retailers, advocacy organizations need different help and information, and we don't have all of those lenses. So yeah, we're very open to input or feedback.
All right, thank you very much. And thank you everybody for joining us.